Tonight we wander through centuries of whispered secrets, across wind-swept coastlines where the Atlantic crashes against cliffs older than memory, and through villages where faces carry stories written not in books, but in bone and blood and ancient light. So snuggle in, pull up your blanket, and let the mists of Ireland guide you home. To sleep. 12,000 years ago, when the last great sheets of ice still clung to the northern mountains of Europe, a narrow land bridge stretched between what we now call Scotland and the northeastern coast of Ireland. The sea was lower then, locked in frozen vaults across the continents, and the world was colder, harsher, yet somehow more open to those brave enough to walk its edge. A small band of hunter-gatherers made that walk. They were not Irish yet, nor British, nor anything that modern maps could name. They were simply people perhaps no more than a few dozen carrying flint tools and woven bags, following the herds of reindeer and wild horse that moved across the tundra. Their skin was dark, their eyes deep brown, their hair thick and curled against the biting wind. They had walked for generations, migrating from the Iberian Peninsula, from lands now submerged beneath the waves of the Bay of Biscay. When they reached the Green Island, they found a place unlike any other. The ice had scraped the land bare, then retreated, leaving behind lakes and rivers and soil, so thin it could barely hold a tree. But the Gulf Stream wrapped the island in unexpected warmth, and the ice-age tundra slowly gave way to dense forests of oak and hazel, to wetlands teeming with birds, to coasts where seals barked and salmon ran in silver rivers. These first settlers did not know they were making history. They knew only survival, the rhythm of seasons, the taste of hazelnuts gathered in autumn, the smell of fish smoking over peat fires. They buried their dead in shallow graves, placed red ochre on their bones, and whispered prayers to spirits they could not see, but felt in every gust of Atlantic wind. Their faces, dark and strong and weathered by cold, were the first faces of Ireland. And though millennia would pass and blood would mix and stories would layer upon stories like sediment in a deep lake, something of them remained a whisper in the bone, a shadow in the iris, a thread in the tapestry that would one day make the Irish face unlike any other in Europe. 5,000 years before the first pyramid rose in Egypt, a new people arrived on Ireland's shores. They came not as conquerors, but as farmers, carrying seeds of wheat and barley, bringing cattle and sheep in small wooden boats that rode the western currents from the continent. They were lighter skinned than the first settlers, their eyes sometimes carrying flecks of green or gray, their hair ranging from deep brown to the color of burnished copper. These Neolithic farmers transformed the island. They cleared the ancient forests with stone axes, creating fields that stretched toward the horizon. They built houses of timber and thatch, circular structures that kept out the rain and held in the warmth of peat fires. But more than their farms, more than their tools, it was their monuments that marked them as different vast stone tombs aligned with the winter solstice, passage graves carved with spirals and zigzags that seemed to move in firelight. At Newgrange they raised a mound so precise that a single beam of dawn light still penetrates its inner chamber on the shortest day of the year, illuminating a stone basin where the bones of their dead once rested. The builders of Newgrange were not giants, as later legends claimed, but ordinary people with extraordinary patience and vision. They worked for generations, moving stones that weighed tons, shaping them with antler picks and polished stones. And as they worked, they mixed with the darker hunter-gatherers who had come before. The children of these unions carried a unique blend skin that could tan under the Irish sun, but never burned as deeply as their southern cousins, eyes that shifted between brown and green, depending on the light, hair that caught the red of sunset, even when it appeared brown in shadow. This was the beginning of the Irish face, not yet fully formed, but taking shape in the wombs of women who spoke languages lost to time, in villages where the Atlantic wind sang through gaps in stone walls. 2,000 years after the first farmers raised their stone monuments, a new wave washed over Ireland's shores. They came from Central Europe, from the valleys of the Rhine and the Danube, from cultures that had learned to smelt copper and tin into bronze. They brought with them new technologies, better axes, sharper swords, jewelry that caught the light like captured fire. The Bronze Age transformed Ireland into a place of wealth and power. The island's copper mines, particularly those in the southwest at places like Mount Gabriel, produced metal of exceptional purity. Gold, washed from the rivers in small nuggets, was hammered into torques and lunulae, crescent-shaped collars that graced the necks of chieftains and priests. These people were taller than their Neolithic ancestors, their features more angular, their cheekbones higher, and more pronounced. They buried their dead in individual graves rather than communal tombs, placing food and drink beside the body for the journey beyond. They built hill forts on high ground, ringed with ditches and wooden palisades, from which they could watch the sea for enemies or friends. And they continued to mix, to marry, to blend their blood with the blood of those who had farmed and hunted before them. The face of Bronze Age Ireland was changing. The dark skin of the first settlers had lightened over generations, not through replacement, but through adaptation. The island's cloudy skies and weak winter sun selected for lighter pigmentation, for bodies that could synthesize vitamin D in conditions where the sun was a rare visitor. The eyes of the people lightened too, green and gray and blue, appearing more frequently, though brown remained dominant. And in some, a new color emerged in the hair, not the dark brown of the continent, not the black of the Mediterranean, but something in between, something that caught the light of peat fires and turned to flame. 1,000 years before a man named Jesus would walk the hills of Galilee, another revolution reached Ireland. Iron, harder and more abundant than bronze, changed everything about how these island people lived and fought and died. The Iron Age brought warriors who rode small horses and carried long swords, who painted their bodies with woad and shouted challenges across misty valleys. These were the Celts, though they would not have called themselves that. They came in waves from the continent, from Gaul and Britain and the distant Rhine, bringing with them a language that would become Gaelic, a culture of bards and druids and chieftains who ruled from hilltop forts. They were not a single people, but a collection of tribes, united by language and custom, rather than blood, and they mixed with the Bronze Age Irish until the distinctions blurred like watercolors in rain. The Celtic face was different from what had come before. These people were often tall, with long skulls and narrow noses, features that spoke of steppe ancestors who had migrated across Europe in ages past. Their skin was fair, sometimes freckled, their eyes a startling blue or green that seemed to glow in the dim light of roundhouses. And their hair was the color of rusted iron, of autumn leaves, of the setting sun reflected in still water. But the Celts did not replace the older population. They absorbed them, married them, learned from them. The Druids of Ireland incorporated the ancient beliefs of the Neolithic farmers into their own religion, worshipping at sacred wells that had been holy for thousands of years, celebrating festivals that marked the same turning points of the year. The face of Iron Age Ireland was a mosaic, a blend of dark and light, of broad and narrow, of ancient and new, and it was this mosaic that would one day puzzle outsiders who expected the Irish to look like their British or continental neighbors. The Romans came to Britain in the year 43 A.D., and for 4 centuries they held the island in an iron grip of roads and forts and cities. But they never came to Ireland, not really. A single expedition under Agricola circled the coast in 81 A.D., and a few traders ventured across the Irish Sea with wine and pottery and coins bearing the faces of emperors. But Ireland remained free, wild, untamed by the legions that marched across Europe from Syria to Scotland. This absence of Rome mattered more than anyone could have known at the time. While Britain was Romanized, its people marrying soldiers from Spain and Syria and the Balkans, its cities filling with faces from across the empire, Ireland remained genetically isolated, a reservoir of ancient European DNA that would be diluted everywhere else but preserved here. In the misty west, like a message in a bottle tossed into a stormy sea. The Irish of this period were a people of small kingdoms, each ruled by a chieftain who claimed descent from a god or a hero. They raided Britain, taking slaves and cattle, and some of those slaves would change the world. A boy named Patricius, captured from a Romano-British family around 405 A.D., would escape, become a priest, and return to Ireland as Saint Patrick, bringing Christianity but not Roman rule, transforming the culture without replacing the people. The Irish face during these centuries was becoming more defined, more distinct. Without the influx of Roman soldiers and settlers, without the genetic mixing that transformed Britain, France, and Spain, the Irish remained closer to their Bronze and Iron Age ancestors. They were not pure no people are, but they were less mixed than their neighbors, a genetic island within a geographical one, and this isolation would preserve features that elsewhere faded into the broader European blend. In the centuries after St. Patrick, Ireland underwent a transformation that was spiritual rather than genetic. Monasteries rose across the landscape, stone complexes that housed scholars and scribes and artists who preserved the knowledge of the ancient world, while Europe beyond the Irish Sea descended into chaos. These monks were Irish, born of Irish mothers and fathers, their faces reflecting the unique blend of ancient blood that had settled the island. They were not the dark-haired, olive-skinned monks of Italy or the fair, blonde monks of Germany. They were something else, often red-haired, with pale skin that burned under the weak Irish sun, with eyes that shifted between green and gray like the sea that surrounded their island. They copied manuscripts and scriptoria lit by tallow candles, their fingers stained with oak gall ink, their voices chanting psalms in Latin that carried a distinctly Irish lilt. These monks traveled, too, establishing monasteries in Scotland, in Northumbria, in Gaul, and Italy. They carried their genes with them, planting Irish faces in foreign soil. Columbanus, the most famous of these wandering scholars, had the typical Irish coloring red hair, fair skin, green eyes that made him stand out in the courts of Merovingian France. His face, his voice, his very presence was Irish, and it was remembered long after his bones turned to dust. But the monastery walls also preserved something else, the genetic isolation that made the Irish different. While monks from other lands might visit, might even stay, the core population of Ireland remained largely unchanged. The faces that looked out from monastery windows were the faces of ancestors who had crossed the land, bridged 12,000 years ago, who had built Newgrange, who had smelted bronze and forged iron, and painted themselves with woad before charging into battle. In 795 A.D., the peace of Irish monasteries was shattered by a new arrival. Longships appeared on the horizon, their dragon prows cutting through the mist like knives through silk. The Vikings had come not as traders but as raiders, and for 2 centuries they would plague the Irish coast, burning monasteries, taking slaves, establishing settlements that would one day become the cities of Dublin, Cork, Limerick, and Waterford. The Vikings were different from anyone the Irish had encountered before. They came from Scandinavia, from the fjords of Norway and the plains of Denmark, and they carried genes that were distinct from the Irish blend. They were often taller, with blonder hair, with eyes the pale blue of Arctic ice, with faces that spoke of a different branch of the European family tree. And yet the Viking impact on the Irish face was less than one might expect. They settled primarily in coastal towns, trading and intermarrying with the Irish, but they never conquered the island as they did parts of Britain and France. Their genetic contribution was significant in certain areas, particularly in Dublin and the southeast, but it was a layer added to an existing tapestry, not a replacement of it. The typical Irish face remained. In the countryside, away from the Viking towns, people looked as they had for millennia, often dark-haired, with a distinctive combination of pale skin and dark eyes that would one day puzzle anthropologists. The red hair that appeared in perhaps 10% of the population was not a Viking trait, but an Irish one, preserved by genetic isolation, carried on genes that had nothing to do with Scandinavia. The Vikings added blondness to the mix, but they did not erase what was already there. In 1169, a new wave of invaders arrived on Irish shores. The Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France, came at the invitation of an Irish king who needed help in a local war. They came with armor and horses and castles of stone, and they stayed, carving out lordships across the eastern half of the island, building towers that still stand today as monuments to their presence. The Normans were genetically complex Viking ancestry mixed with French, with perhaps a dash of the older Gallo-Roman population. They were often dark-haired, with the robust features that came from their Scandinavian ancestors, tempered by generations in France. They intermarried with the Irish, particularly in the first generations, when they were few and the Irish were many. But the Norman impact on the Irish face was, like the Viking before it, a layer rather than a transformation. The Normans settled primarily in the east and south, in the fertile lowlands where castles could control the surrounding countryside. In the west, in the mountains of Connaught and the wild coasts of Donegal and Kerry, the older Irish populations remained largely untouched, their faces continuing to reflect the ancient blend of hunter-gatherer, farmer, Bronze Age metalworker, and Iron Age Celt. By the 14th century, the Normans had become more Irish than the Irish themselves, as the saying went. They spoke Irish, followed Irish customs, married Irish women, and their descendants looked Irish because they were Irish, genetically indistinguishable from their neighbors after a few generations of mixing. The tower houses they built remained, but the faces that looked out from their windows were the same faces that had looked out from round houses 2,000 years before. The 16th and 17th centuries brought a new kind of invasion to Ireland, not the raid of Vikings or the conquest of Normans, but the systematic colonization of entire provinces. The plantations of Ulster, beginning in 1609, brought Scottish and English settlers to the north of Ireland, giving them land that had been confiscated from Irish chieftains who had resisted English rule. These settlers were different. They came in large numbers, whole communities transplanted from the lowlands of Scotland and the north of England. They were predominantly Protestant, speaking English or Scots, carrying genes that were more Anglo-Saxon, more Scandinavian, more continental than the Irish they displaced. They settled, they farmed, they built churches and schools and towns, and they remained distinct, a separate community within the larger Irish population. The impact on the North was profound. Ulster became a divided land, Irish and British living side by side but rarely mixing, their faces reflecting different genetic histories. The Scottish settlers were often fair, with the reddish-blonde hair of the lowlands, with blue eyes and ruddy complexions that marked them as different from the darker Irish around them. But even here, mixing occurred, particularly in rural areas where isolation and proximity overcame religious and political barriers. In the South and West, the plantations were less successful, and the older Irish populations remained dominant. The face of rural Ireland, dark hair, pale skin, eyes that shifted between brown and green persisted, preserved by poverty and isolation, by the simple fact that few outsiders wanted to settle in the boggy, mountainous, economically backward west of the island. In 1845, a fungus arrived in Ireland on ships from North America, and within 5 years it had destroyed the potato crop that fed half the island's population. The Great Famine killed 1 million people and forced another million to emigrate, scattering the Irish across the world like seeds on the wind. They went to America, to Canada, to Australia, to Britain, carrying their faces and their genes to new lands where they would mix and change and yet somehow remain distinct. The Irish who emigrated were not a random sample of the population. They were predominantly from the west and south, from the poorest regions, from the populations that had remained most genetically isolated over the centuries. They carried the ancient Irish blend with them, the dark hair, the pale skin, the eyes that seemed to change color with the weather, the occasional splash of red that marked the deep Celtic strain. In America they settled in cities, in Boston and New York and Philadelphia, in crowded tenements where their faces stood out among the German and English and Scandinavian immigrants who had come before them. They were often darker than their neighbors, their black hair and blue eyes a combination that seemed exotic, their pale skin that burned rather than tanned a mark of their northern origins. They were called Black Irish by some, a term that spoke more to American confusion than to Irish reality. But they also mixed. They married German Catholics, Italian immigrants, anyone who shared their faith if not their blood. And in mixing, they spread the Irish face across America, creating a diaspora that looked slightly different from the Ireland left behind. That carried the ancient genes in new combinations that would one day puzzle geneticists trying to trace the origins of European populations. In the late 20th century, a new tool emerged for understanding why the Irish look different. Genetics, the science of DNA, allowed researchers to peer into the past with a precision that archaeology and history could never match. They could extract DNA from ancient bones, sequence the genomes of modern populations, and compare them across time and space to reveal the hidden migrations that had shaped the Irish face. The first major study came in 2015, when geneticists at Trinity College Dublin analyzed the DNA of 4 Irish individuals who had lived between 3,200 and 4,000 years ago. The results were startling. These Bronze Age Irish were genetically distinct from their contemporaries in Britain and continental Europe, carrying a unique blend of ancestries that had been preserved on the island for thousands of years. They were not pure Celts, whatever that might mean. They carried genes from the first hunter-gatherers who had walked across the land bridge, from the Neolithic farmers who had built Newgrange, from the Bronze Age metalworkers who had worn gold lunulae. But they also lacked something, the genetic contributions from later migrations that had transformed the rest of Europe. The Romans had never come. The Anglo-Saxons had barely touched the West. The Normans had been absorbed. The result was a population that was more genetically homogeneous than almost anywhere else in Europe, a living museum of ancient DNA. This genetic isolation explained much about the Irish face. The high frequency of dark hair and pale skin, the distinctive eye colors, the occasional red hair that appeared in a minority of the population, all of these were markers of this ancient blend, preserved by geography and history from the mixing that had homogenized other European populations. One of the most surprising discoveries of modern genetics was the close relationship between the Irish and the Basques, a people who live in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. The Basques speak a language unrelated to any other in Europe, and they have long been considered a genetic isolate, a remnant of the prehistoric population that existed before the Indo-European migrations that transformed the continent. The genetic link between the Irish and the Basques suggested a shared ancestry that predated the Celtic migrations. Both populations carried high levels of the Y chromosome haplogroup R1b, particularly the subclade R1 BM269, which was rare in the rest of Europe but common in the Atlantic fringe from Iberia to Ireland. This suggested that the ancestors of both peoples had migrated up the Atlantic coast during the Mesolithic period, following the rich fishing grounds and seal colonies that lined the western edge of the continent. The faces of the Basques and the Irish shared certain features, a tendency toward dark hair, a certain shape of the skull, a particular distribution of facial features that set them apart from their neighbors. But there were differences too. The Basques had been more influenced by later migrations from the Mediterranean, while the Irish had remained more isolated. The result was 2 populations that were genetic cousins, but not twins, related but distinct. This Atlantic connection explained why the Irish face seemed different from the British face, why it carried echoes of Iberia rather than the Germanic north. The Irish were not Celts who had crossed from Britain, as the old stories claimed. They were Atlantic people, shaped by the ocean that surrounded them, carrying genes that spoke of fishing boats and coastal paths. of a slow migration along the western edge of Europe that had ended on the green island where the Atlantic met the land. No discussion of why the Irish look different can ignore the most distinctive feature of all red hair. While only about 10% of the Irish population has red hair, the frequency is higher than almost anywhere else in the world, concentrated particularly in the west and southwest of the island. For centuries, this red hair marked the Irish as different, as exotic, as somehow other in a Europe where dark and blonde were the norms. The genetics of red hair are relatively well understood. It is caused by variants in the MC1R gene, which controls the production of melanin, the pigment that gives color to skin, hair, and eyes. When certain variants of this gene are present, they produce pheomelanin, a red-yellow pigment, rather than eumelanin, the brown-black pigment that colors most human hair. What is less understood is why these variants are so common in Ireland. The MC1R variants that cause red hair are found across Europe, but they reach their highest frequencies in the Atlantic Fringe Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and the western coast of Norway. This distribution suggests that the variants were present in the prehistoric population of this region and were preserved by genetic isolation. The red hair of the Irish is not a Celtic trait, as once believed. The ancient Celts of Central Europe were more likely dark-haired, and the Roman descriptions of the Gauls mention blonde hair more often than red. The red hair of the Atlantic Fringe is older, deeper, a legacy of the first settlers who adapted to the weak sunlight of the northern latitudes by producing less melanin, allowing their skin to synthesize vitamin D more efficiently. The red hair was a side effect of this adaptation, a genetic quirk that became common because the population was small and isolated enough for genetic drift to amplify it. Perhaps the most puzzling feature of the Irish face is the eyes. Not their color, though the high frequency of blue and green eyes in Ireland is itself notable, but their quality, the way they seem to shift between colors, to catch the light differently than other European eyes, to hold depths that seem almost otherworldly. The genetics of eye color are complex, involving multiple genes that interact in ways that are still not fully understood. But the high frequency of light eyes in Ireland, blue, green, gray, and the distinctive hazel that seems to contain all these colors at once speaks to the same genetic isolation that preserved other distinctive features. The light eyes of the Irish are an adaptation to the northern latitude, where sunlight is weak and vitamin D synthesis is a constant challenge. Light eyes allow more light to enter the retina, improving vision in dim conditions, and they are associated with lighter skin that can more efficiently produce vitamin D. These traits were selected for over thousands of years, becoming common in populations that lived at high latitudes with little sun. But there is something else about Irish eyes, something that goes beyond genetics. Perhaps it is the combination of colors, the way that brown and green and gold seem to swirl together in the iris, creating patterns that are unique to each individual. Perhaps it is the contrast with the pale skin and dark hair that is common in the population, creating a striking appearance that catches the attention. Or perhaps it is simply the result of centuries of genetic isolation, of a small population breeding largely within itself, amplifying features that in larger, more mixed populations would be diluted and lost. The pale skin of the Irish is another feature that sets them apart, particularly when combined with dark hair. In most of Europe, pale skin is associated with blonde hair and light eyes, the classic Nordic phenotype. But in Ireland, pale skin often appears with dark hair and dark eyes, creating a contrast that seems almost Mediterranean, but is genetically distinct. This pale skin is an adaptation to the Irish climate, where cloudy skies are the norm, and the sun is a rare visitor, even in summer. The weak sunlight at Ireland's latitude, roughly 51 to 55 degrees north, means that dark skin would severely limit vitamin D synthesis, leading to health problems. Over thousands of years, natural selection favored lighter skin, which could produce vitamin D even in minimal sunlight. But the Irish climate is not as cold as the Scandinavian climate, where the palest skin evolved. Ireland is warmed by the Gulf Stream, making it milder than other places at the same latitude. This means that the Irish did not need the extreme paleness of the Scandinavians, nor did they develop the blonde hair that is associated with the palest skin in Northern Europe. Instead, they evolved a moderate paleness, a skin tone that could synthesize vitamin D in Irish conditions without burning in the occasional strong sunlight. The result is a distinctive combination skin that is pale, but not the palest, hair that is often dark, but sometimes red, eyes that range from brown to blue to green to hazel. It is a face that carries the marks of its environment, shaped by the weak sun and the cloudy skies and the green landscape that reflects what little light there is. Physical anthropologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries were obsessed with measuring skulls. They believed that the shape of the head, long or round, high or low, broad or narrow, could reveal racial and ethnic differences. While much of this work was tainted by racism and pseudoscience, the basic observation that skull shapes vary between populations is true, and the Irish skull does have distinctive features. Studies of Irish skulls, both ancient and modern, reveal a tendency toward dolichocephaly, long, narrow heads, rather than the brachycephaly, or round-headedness, that is common in Central and Eastern Europe. This long-headedness is associated with the earliest European populations, the hunter-gatherers who migrated from the Middle East during the Paleolithic period, and it has been preserved in the Atlantic fringe while being replaced elsewhere by the rounder skulls of later migrants. The Irish face tends to be longer than the British face, with a more prominent chin, a narrower jaw, and higher cheekbones. These features are not universal. There is enormous variation within any population, but they appear more frequently in Ireland than in neighboring populations. They are the legacy of the first settlers, preserved by isolation, visible in the faces that look out from Irish portraits and photographs. This skull shape contributes to the overall impression of the Irish face as different, as distinctive. It is not a dramatic difference. No one would mistake an Irish person for someone from East Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, but it is a subtle variation on the European theme, a note that is slightly off-key, a color that is slightly different from the expected shade. Freckles are small, concentrated spots of melanin that appear on the skin, particularly on the face, arms, and shoulders. They are associated with fair skin and red or blonde hair, and they are more common in populations that live at high latitudes with weak sunlight. The Irish have one of the highest rates of freckling in the world, particularly among those with red or fair hair. Freckles are not a sign of poor health or a lack of melanin. Rather, they are a different way of distributing melanin in the skin. While most people produce melanin evenly across their skin, giving them a uniform tan, people with freckles produce melanin in patches, creating the spotted pattern that is so distinctive. The genetics of freckling are linked to the same MC1R variants that cause red hair. People with certain variants of this gene are more likely to freckle and less likely to tan. This is an adaptation to the Irish climate, where strong sunlight is rare, but when it occurs, it can be intense enough to cause sunburn. Freckles provide some protection against UV radiation without the need for a full tan, which would be unnecessary in a climate where sunny days are the exception rather than the rule. The freckled face is one of the most recognizable Irish types, particularly when combined with red hair and green eyes. It is a face that speaks of adaptation to a specific environment, of thousands of years of evolution in a place where the sun is weak but occasionally fierce, where the skin must balance the need for vitamin D synthesis against the risk of sun damage. The term Black Irish has been used for centuries to describe Irish people with dark hair, dark eyes, and pale skin. The origin of the term is unclear. Some trace it to the Spanish sailors who were shipwrecked on the Irish coast during the Spanish Armada of 1588, suggesting that their genes entered the Irish population. Others see it as a description of the dark-haired Irish in contrast to the fairer Nordic Irish of the north and east. Genetic studies have largely debunked the Spanish origin theory. While a few Spanish sailors may have survived and settled in Ireland, their genetic contribution to the population was negligible. The dark hair and dark eyes of the Black Irish are not Mediterranean imports, but ancient Irish features carried by the first settlers who migrated from Iberia 12,000 years ago and preserved by genetic isolation. The dark-haired Irish are, in fact, the most genetically Irish of all. They carry the highest proportion of the ancient hunter-gatherer and farmer DNA that makes the Irish distinct from other Europeans. Their faces are the faces of the first settlers, of the builders of Newgrange, of the Bronze Age metalworkers and Iron Age warriors. They are not Spanish, not Mediterranean, not anything other than deeply, anciently Irish. The persistence of the Black Irish myth speaks to the human need for exotic explanations, for stories that make the familiar strange. It is more romantic to imagine Spanish galleons and shipwrecked sailors than to accept that the dark-haired Irish are simply the descendants of the first people who walked across the land bridge, their features preserved by isolation and chance. While dark hair and red hair are the most distinctive Irish types, there is also a significant minority of blonde Irish, particularly in the east and north of the island. These blonde Irish are often the descendants of Viking and Norman settlers, of Scottish planters and English colonists, their fair hair a marker of more recent genetic input. But not all blonde Irish are of foreign descent. Some blondness in the Irish population is ancient, carried by the same Bronze Age ancestors who brought the genes for light eyes and fair skin. The ancient Irish were not uniformly dark-haired, and the genetic variation that produces blonde hair existed in the population long before the Vikings arrived. The blonde Irish face is different from the Scandinavian blonde face. It tends to be softer, less angular, with a rounder jaw and fuller cheeks. The eyes are more likely to be green or hazel, rather than the pale blue of the north. The skin, while fair, is more likely to freckle than to tan. It is a distinctively Irish blondness, shaped by the same genetic isolation that produced the dark-haired and red-haired types. The existence of blonde Irish alongside the dark-haired and red-haired majority is another marker of the genetic diversity that exists within the Irish population. The Irish are not a single type, but a spectrum, a range of features that all carry the mark of the island's unique genetic history. Today, Ireland is no longer the genetic isolate it once was. The 20th and 21st centuries brought new migrations, Polish and Lithuanian workers during the Celtic Tiger boom, African and Asian immigrants seeking new opportunities, refugees from war and poverty, Europeans of every description drawn by Ireland's growing economy and open society. These new arrivals are changing the Irish face, adding new colors and features to the ancient blend. The child of an Irish mother and a Nigerian father, of a Polish father and an Irish mother, carries a new combination, a new possibility, a face that is neither purely Irish nor purely foreign, but something new, something that has never existed before. But the ancient Irish face is not disappearing. It is preserved in the rural West, in the Gael-tacked areas where Irish is still spoken, in the families who have lived in the same valley for generations. It is preserved in the diaspora, in the Irish Americans and Irish Australians who carry the genes of the famine emigrants. And it is preserved in the DNA of every Irish person, whatever their outward appearance, a genetic legacy that connects them to the first settlers, to the builders of Newgrange, to the monks and warriors and farmers who shaped the island. The Irish face is changing, as all faces change over time. But the story of why the Irish look different is not ending. It is simply entering a new chapter, one that will be written by the children of today's Ireland. Their faces a blend of ancient and modern, of isolation and connection, of the green island and the wider world. The economic boom of the 1990s and early 2000s, known as the Celtic Tiger, transformed Ireland from one of Europe's poorest countries to one of its wealthiest. With wealth came immigration, as workers from across Europe and beyond came to build the new Ireland. Polish construction workers, Lithuanian nurses, Brazilian meat packers, Chinese students, they all arrived, bringing their genes and their faces to a land that had seen little immigration for centuries. The children of this period are now adults, and their faces reflect the new Ireland. In Dublin, in Cork, in Galway, you can see faces that would have been unimaginable. A generation ago, dark skin with green eyes, Asian features with red hair, African hair texture with the pale skin of the Irish North. These are the faces of a new Ireland, a global Ireland, an Ireland that is no longer an island in the genetic sense. But even in this mixing, the ancient Irish features persist. The Polish Irish child often has the high cheekbones of both parents. The Nigerian Irish child often carries the pale skin of the Irish parent alongside the dark skin of the Nigerian. The Chinese Irish child may have the black hair of both parents, but the green eyes of the Irish grandparent. Genetics is not a simple blending, but a recombination, a shuffling of cards that produces unexpected hands. The Celtic Tiger's children are writing a new chapter in the story of the Irish face. They are proving that the Irish look is not a fixed type, but a genetic potential, a set of features that can appear in new combinations, that can be carried forward into a future where the old isolation is replaced by new connections. For centuries, the Irish diaspora scattered across the world, carrying their genes to America and Australia, to Britain and Canada, to every corner of the globe where opportunity beckoned. These immigrants often married within their communities, preserving their Irish features in enclaves from Boston to Brisbane. But they also mixed, marrying Italians and Germans and Poles and everyone else who shared their Catholic faith or their urban neighborhoods. The result is a diaspora that looks both Irish and not Irish. The Irish American often has the dark hair and pale skin of the Irish ancestor, but with a rounder face, a fuller jaw, features that speak of German or Italian mixing. The Irish Australian may have the red hair of the Irish West, but with the taller stature and broader shoulders of the British convict ancestor. They are Irish, but they are also something else, a blend that reflects the melting pot of their new homes. In recent decades, some of this diaspora has returned to Ireland, drawn by the economic opportunities of the Celtic tiger, or simply by a desire to reconnect with their ancestral land. They bring their mixed genes with them, adding another layer to the Irish genetic tapestry. The Irish American who marries an Irish person from Cork produces children who are more Irish than the American parent, but less Irish than the Cork parent. Their faces a bridge between the old island and the new world. This return migration is changing the Irish face in subtle ways, adding new variations to the ancient blend. It is a reminder that the Irish look has never been static, that even during the centuries of isolation, there was always some mixing, some movement, some exchange with the wider world. For centuries, Irish artists have tried to capture the distinctive Irish face. From the medieval monks who illuminated manuscripts with figures that seem more symbolic than realistic, to the portrait painters of the 18th and 19th centuries who sought to capture the character of their subjects, to the photographers of the 20th century who documented the faces of rural Ireland before they disappeared. The Irish face in art is often idealized, made more Celtic, more ancient, more romantic than reality. The paintings of the Celtic Revival show men with flowing red hair and women with pale skin and dark eyes, faces that seem to belong to a mythic past rather than the present. The photographs of the early 20th century, by contrast, show the reality-weathered faces, missing teeth, eyes that hold both humor and hardship, the marks of poverty and hard work written in every line. But both the idealized and the realistic portraits capture something true about the Irish face. They show the range of features that exists within the population, from the dark-haired, dark-eyed type of the West to the fair-haired, blue-eyed type of the East. They show the pale skin that seems to glow in the weak Irish light. They show the expressions, quizzical, humorous, resilient, that seem to be as much a part of the Irish face as the physical features. The face in art is not the face in life. It is a selection, an interpretation, a way of seeing that reveals as much about the artist as about the subject. But it is also a record, a way of preserving the Irish look for future generations who may wonder what their ancestors looked like, who may search for their own features in the faces of the past. American cinema has had a complex relationship with the Irish face. In the early 20th century, Irish actors were often typecast as cops, priests, or maids, their faces used to signal a certain ethnicity without requiring the audience to think too deeply about what that ethnicity meant. The Irish face on screen was often a caricature: red hair, freckles, a brogue so thick it was almost unintelligible. Actors like Maureen O'Hara embodied a certain ideal of Irish beauty: red hair, green eyes, pale skin, a fiery temperament that matched the stereotype. Her face was genuinely Irish, but it was also a selected type, the one that fit American expectations of what Irish beauty should look like. The darker Irish, the blonde Irish, the Irish who looked more English or more Mediterranean than Celtic, were less visible on screen. In recent decades, this has changed. Irish actors like Cillian Murphy, with his pale skin and striking blue eyes, or Saoirse Ronan, with her dark hair and expressive face, represent a broader range of Irish types. They are not the caricature Irish, but the real Irish with all the genetic diversity that implies. Their success suggests that American audiences are ready to see the Irish face in all its variety, not just the red-haired, freckled stereotype. The Hollywood Irish face is a mirror, reflecting American fantasies back at themselves. But it is also a window, allowing Americans to see something of the real Ireland, the genetic complexity, the ancient history, the unique blend of features that makes the Irish look different from every other European. In 2015, a team of geneticists led by Dr. Dan Bradley at Trinity College Dublin published a groundbreaking study. They had extracted DNA from the remains of a Neolithic woman buried near Belfast 4,000 years ago, and from 3 men buried on Rathlin Island during the Bronze Age, around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. The results rewrote the history of the Irish face. The Neolithic woman they found was most similar to modern people from Spain and Portugal, confirming the ancient link between the Irish and the Iberian Peninsula. Her face, if she could be reconstructed, would probably have been dark-haired and dark-eyed, with skin that was lighter than her Mesolithic ancestors, but still darker than modern Irish. The Bronze Age men were different. They carried a significant amount of DNA from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, suggesting a major migration during the Bronze Age that replaced much of the earlier population. These men would have looked more like modern Irish lighter skin, perhaps blue or green eyes, the genetic foundations of the distinctive Irish face. But the study also found something else, a remarkable genetic continuity. The modern Irish, particularly those from the west of the island, were more similar to these Bronze Age ancestors than to any other European population. The isolation that had preserved the Irish face was not a myth but a genetic reality, measurable in the DNA of people alive today. This genetic map is a portrait of the Irish face at the molecular level. It shows the migrations that shaped it, the isolations that preserved it, the mixtures that added new colors to the ancient palette. It is a scientific validation of what Irish people have always known instinctively, that they look different, that their faces carry a history, written not in books but in genes. Rathlin Island, a small rocky outpost off the north coast of Ireland, holds a special place in the genetic history of the Irish face. It was here, in a Bronze Age burial site, that the 3 men whose DNA would reshape our understanding of Irish origins were found. Their bones, buried with food vessels and flint tools, had lain undisturbed for 4 millennia, preserving their genetic secrets until modern science could unlock them. These men were not typical Bronze Age Europeans. Their DNA showed a massive influx of genes from the steppe, the grasslands of modern Ukraine and Russia, where a culture of horse-riding warriors had emerged around 5,000 years ago. These steppe people had migrated across Europe, bringing their genes, their languages, and perhaps their faces to every corner of the continent. But the Rathlin Island men were also distinct. They carried more of the ancient hunter-gatherer DNA than their continental counterparts, suggesting that the steppe migrants had mixed with the existing Irish population rather than replacing it entirely. They were a blend, a new combination of ancient and new that would become the foundation of the modern Irish face. If these men could be reconstructed, what would they look like? Geneticists believe they would have had light skin, perhaps blue or green eyes, and hair that ranged from dark brown to the early stages of the red that would become so distinctive. They would have been tall, with the robust features that came from their steppe ancestors. They would have looked Irish, not because they were identical to modern Irish, but because they carried the genetic foundation from which the modern Irish face would emerge. Beneath the steppe DNA, beneath the farmer DNA, beneath all the layers of migration and mixing, lies the oldest layer of all the DNA of the first hunter-gatherers who walked across the land bridge 12,000 years ago. This DNA is still present in modern Irish, particularly in the West, where genetic isolation preserved it most strongly. These first settlers were not European in the modern sense. Their DNA shows affinities with populations from the Middle East, from the ancient Near East, where agriculture was first invented. They were dark-skinned with deep brown eyes and black hair, their faces shaped by a different evolutionary history than the lighter Europeans who would follow them. The persistence of this ancient DNA in modern Irish is one of the reasons the Irish face looks different. It contributes to the dark hair that is so common, to the deep brown eyes that appear alongside the more famous green and blue, to the facial structure that is subtly different from the Anglo-Saxon or Scandinavian norm. It is a whisper from the deep past, a genetic ghost that haunts the modern Irish face. When an Irish person looks in the mirror and sees dark hair and dark eyes, they are seeing the hunter-gatherers who first settled the island. When they see pale skin, they are seeing the adaptations of later generations. When they see red hair, they are seeing a genetic quirk that emerged from this unique blend. The Irish face is a palimpsest, written and rewritten by history, but with the oldest writing still visible beneath the newer layers. The Neolithic farmers who arrived in Ireland around 6,000 years ago brought more than seeds and cattle. They brought genes that would reshape the Irish face, lightening the skin, changing the eye colors, adding new features to the ancient hunter-gatherer base. These farmers were themselves a mixed population, carrying DNA from the ancient Near East and from the European hunter-gatherers they had encountered and absorbed as they spread across the continent. The farmer DNA in Ireland is particularly interesting because it is so well preserved. In most of Europe, the farmer genes were largely replaced by the steppe migrants of the Bronze Age. But in Ireland, the replacement was less complete, perhaps because the island's isolation allowed the existing population to absorb the newcomers rather than being overwhelmed by them. The legacy of the farmers can be seen in the Irish face today. They contributed to the lighter skin, to the range of eye colors, to the facial features that are neither fully hunter-gatherer nor fully steppe, but a unique blend of both. They contributed the genes for lactose tolerance, allowing adult Irish to drink milk, a trait that is nearly universal in the population. And they contributed the cultural practices, farming, herding, settled life, that shaped the Irish landscape, and, indirectly, the Irish face. The farmer's legacy is the landscape itself, the fields they cleared, the stone walls they built, the monuments they raised. These shaped the environment in which later generations lived and evolved. The Irish face was shaped not just by genes, but by the land, by the green fields and the misty mountains and the rocky coasts that reflected light in ways that selected for certain features over others. The Bronze Age migration from the steppe was the last major genetic transformation of the Irish face. These migrants brought genes for lighter skin, for blue eyes, for features that would become the foundation of the modern Irish look. But they also brought something else, a cultural package that included the Indo-European language that would become Gaelic, the warrior ethos that would define Irish society for millennia, and perhaps the genetic variants that would one day produce red hair. The steppe migrants were not a single people, but a collection of tribes, united by culture and language rather than by blood. They carried a mix of ancestries themselves, including DNA from the ancient hunter-gatherers of Europe and from the early farmers of the Near East. When they arrived in Ireland, they found a population that was itself a mix of hunter-gatherer and farmer, and the resulting blend was the Irish face as we know it. This transformation was rapid in evolutionary terms, occurring over a few centuries rather than millennia. It suggests that the steppe migrants had some advantage, perhaps technological, perhaps cultural, perhaps simply demographic, that allowed them to spread their genes quickly through the existing population. But it also suggests that the existing population was not simply replaced, but absorbed, contributing their own genes to the new blend. The steppe transformation is visible in the Irish face today in the lighter skin, the higher frequency of blue and green eyes, the facial structure that is more European than the ancient hunter-gatherer base. It is the most recent major layer in the Irish genetic palimpsest, the one that brought the Irish face closest to the modern European norm, while still preserving the distinctiveness that sets it apart. After the Bronze Age, Ireland entered a long period of genetic isolation. The island's position on the western edge of Europe, surrounded by water, made migration difficult. The lack of Roman conquest meant no influx of soldiers and settlers from the Mediterranean. The limited Viking and Norman impact meant that these later migrations were layers on top of an existing base rather than transformations of it. This isolation had a profound effect on the Irish face. In large mixed populations, genetic diversity is high, and distinctive features tend to be diluted. In small, isolated populations, genetic diversity is lower, and distinctive features can become more common through a process known as genetic drift. The Irish face is the product of this drift of thousands of years, in which a small population bred largely within itself, amplifying certain features while others faded away. The isolation effect is visible in the high frequency of certain genetic variants in Ireland. The MC1R variants that cause red hair are more common than in much larger populations. Certain facial features, the high cheekbones, the long skull, the particular shape of the eyes, appear more frequently than chance would predict. These are not the result of any single migration, but of the slow accumulation of genetic change in an isolated population. The end of this isolation in the modern era is changing the Irish face, adding new genetic diversity, diluting the ancient features. But the isolation effect will persist for generations, visible in the faces of those whose ancestry is predominantly Irish, a reminder of the centuries when the island was a genetic world unto itself. The 21st century has brought a new kind of Irish face into being. The child of an Irish parent and a parent from Nigeria, India, China, or Brazil carries a new combination of features, a new possibility that did not exist in previous generations. These global Irish are changing the visual landscape of the island, adding new colors and shapes to the ancient blend. But they are also preserving it. The Irish parent contributes half of the child's DNA, including the genes for pale skin, for light eyes, for the facial structure that is distinctively Irish. These features may be modified by the other parent's genes, but they do not disappear. The global Irish child with dark skin and green eyes, with African hair texture and Irish cheekbones, is a new kind of Irish face, but one that carries the ancient legacy forward. This global mixing is not unique to Ireland. It is happening across Europe, across the world, as migration and intermarriage break down the genetic barriers that once separated populations. But in Ireland it has a special significance because the Irish face was so distinct, so preserved by isolation, that the change is more visible, more dramatic, more meaningful. The global Irish face is the future, but it is also the past. It carries all the layers of Irish history: the hunter-gatherer, the farmer, the steppe migrant, the Viking, the Norman, the planter, along with new layers from across the world. It is a face that speaks of connection rather than isolation, of a world where the green island is no longer a genetic fortress, but a welcome harbor for all who choose to make it home. While Dublin and the east of Ireland become increasingly diverse, the west remains a stronghold of the ancient Irish face. Counties like Donegal, Mayo, Galway, and Kerry have seen less immigration than the urban centers, and their populations retain a higher proportion of the genetic features that have defined the Irish look for millennia. In the Gaeltacht areas where Irish is still spoken as a first language, the faces often show the classic Irish type: dark hair, pale skin, eyes that shift between green and gray, the occasional redhead standing out like a flame against the green landscape. These are not museum pieces or genetic curiosities, but living people carrying forward the ancient legacy in their daily lives. The preservation of the Western Irish face is partly due to geography, the rugged coasts and mountains that discourage settlement, and partly due to culture. The Gaeltacht communities have been more resistant to change, more protective of their traditions, including the patterns of marriage and family that preserve their genes. But they are not isolated anymore. Television, internet, tourism, and migration have brought the world to their doorsteps. Whether the Western Irish face will persist into the future is an open question. As young people leave for the cities and the diaspora, as outsiders move in seeking the beauty of the western coast, the genetic isolation that preserved the ancient face is breaking down. The future may see the classic Irish type become rare, preserved only in photographs and memories, a ghost of a genetic past. The Irish diaspora, scattered across the world, carries the Irish face with them, but changed by mixing and time. The Irish American of the 21st century is often several generations removed from the famine emigrant. Their Irish DNA diluted by German, Italian, Polish, and every other ancestry that America has welcomed. They may have an Irish name, an Irish grandmother, a memory of St. Patrick's Day celebrations, but their face may show little of the ancient Irish type. Yet the diaspora also preserves the Irish face in ways that the homeland does not. In Boston and Chicago and Sydney, there are Irish enclaves where the ancient features persist, where cousins marry cousins, where the genetic isolation of the old country is recreated in the new. These communities are shrinking, breaking down under the pressure of American mobility and mixing, but they are still there, visible in the faces that look out from Irish pubs and parish halls. The diaspora's face is a mirror of Ireland's history. It shows the famine that drove 1 million to emigrate, the poverty that kept them in ethnic ghettos, the discrimination that forced them to marry within their community. It shows the gradual assimilation, the breaking down of barriers, the mixing that transformed the Irish face in America from a distinct type to one thread in a multicolored tapestry. For those in the diaspora who want to reconnect with their Irish roots, the face can be a guide. A DNA test can reveal the proportion of Irish ancestry, can connect the living to the long dead. But the face is more than DNA. It is the expression, the gesture, the way of holding the head that speaks of culture as much as genetics. The diaspora's face is Irish, but it is also American, Australian, Canadian, a new creation, shaped by history, carrying the past into the future. The distinctive Irish face is not just a matter of appearance. It has medical implications, genetic variants that are more common in the Irish population than in others, affecting health and disease. The pale skin that is so characteristic of the Irish also makes them more susceptible to skin cancer, particularly melanoma, which is more common in Ireland than in most of Europe. The genetic isolation that preserved the Irish face also preserved harmful variants. Cystic fibrosis, a life-threatening lung disease, is more common in Ireland than anywhere else in the world, carried on genes that became common through genetic drift in the small, isolated population. Hemochromatosis, a condition of iron overload, is also unusually common, another legacy of the ancient genes that shaped the Irish face. But the Irish face also carries protective variants. The high frequency of lactose tolerance, inherited from the Neolithic farmers, allows adult Irish to digest milk, a nutritional advantage in a historical diet that relied heavily on dairy. Certain genetic variants may protect against specific diseases, though research in this area is still ongoing. Understanding the genetics of the Irish face is not just about appearance or history. It is about health, about medicine tailored to a specific population, about recognizing that the distinctive features that make the Irish look different also carry implications for their well-being. The face is a window not just to the past, but to the future, to the medical possibilities that genetic knowledge can unlock. Modern science can do something remarkable. It can reconstruct the faces of the dead. From a skull, from DNA, from the careful analysis of bone structure and genetic markers, forensic artists and geneticists can create an image of what a person looked like in life. This technology has been applied to the ancient Irish, bringing faces from the past into the present. The reconstructed face of the Neolithic woman from Ballynahattie, near Belfast, shows a woman with dark hair and dark eyes. her skin lighter than her Mesolithic ancestors, but still darker than modern Irish. Her face is broad, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, features that speak of her mixed ancestry. She does not look modern, but she does not look foreign either. There is something in her face that echoes in the faces of Irish people today. The Bronze Age men from Rathlin Island have also been reconstructed, their faces showing the lighter skin and more European features that the steppe migration brought. They look more like modern Irish, but with differences. Their faces are broader, their eyes set differently, their expressions impossible to know, but imagined by the artists who recreated them. These reconstructions are not photographs. They are interpretations, educated guesses based on limited data. But they are powerful, bringing the ancient dead to life, allowing us to look into faces that shaped the Irish face we know today. They are a bridge across time, a way of seeing the past in the present, of recognizing that the Irish face is not a static type, but a living history. In the past 2 decades, commercial DNA testing has transformed how people understand their ancestry. Companies like Ancestry DNA and 23 and Me can analyze a person's genome and tell them where their ancestors came from, what populations they belong to, what features they're likely to have. For the Irish diaspora, these tests have been particularly powerful, confirming or challenging family stories of Irish origin. The tests reveal what geneticists already knew, that the Irish are a distinct population, genetically different from the British, from the continent, from everyone else in Europe. An Irish person taking a DNA test will typically see a high percentage of Irish ancestry, often higher than the British or Scottish categories, confirming the genetic isolation that preserved the Irish face. But the tests also reveal the mixing that has always existed. The Irish person with a Viking ancestor will see Scandinavian in their results. The Irish person with Norman ancestry will see French and German. The Irish person with planter ancestors will see British and Irish as a combined category, reflecting the genetic similarity that mixing created. For many, the DNA test is a revelation, a scientific validation of their Irish identity. For others, it is a surprise, showing ancestry they did not know they had. But for all, it is a reminder that the Irish face is written in the genes, that the distinctive features that make the Irish look different have a basis in DNA that can be measured and mapped and understood. The Irish face has been mythologized for centuries, wrapped in stories that explain its distinctiveness in ways that science now reveals to be false, but that still hold power in the imagination. The legend of the Milesians, the mythical Spanish ancestors of the Irish, was used for centuries to explain the dark hair and pale skin of the Black Irish. The legend of the Tuatha De Danann, the godlike race who ruled Ireland before the Celts, was used to explain the red hair and green eyes that seemed almost supernatural. These myths are not science. They are stories created by people who did not have genetics or archaeology to explain why they looked the way they did. But they are not without value. They reflect the Irish sense of themselves as different, as special, as a people set apart by geography and history. They reflect the human need to explain the inexplicable, to find meaning in the accidents of genetics and evolution. The mythologized Irish face appears in literature and art. in the descriptions of writers from Synge to Joyce, and the paintings of the Celtic revival. It is a face of mystery and magic, of ancient wisdom and wild beauty, of a connection to the land that goes deeper than mere residence. It is not the real Irish face, but it is a face that the Irish have chosen to present to the world, a mask that reveals as much as it conceals. Science has replaced myth as the explanation for why the Irish look different. But myth persists because science cannot answer the questions that myth addresses, the questions of identity, of belonging, of what it means to be Irish in a world that is constantly changing. Walk through Dublin today, or Galway, or Cork, and look at the faces around you. You will see the ancient Irish types, the dark-haired, pale-skinned men and women whose faces echo the first settlers. You will see the red hair that marks the deep Celtic strain. You will see the blue and green eyes that speak of the steppe migrants. But you will also see faces that would have been impossible a generation ago, faces that speak of Poland and Nigeria and China and Brazil, of a new Ireland that is no longer a genetic island. The face in the crowd is changing, as it has always changed. The Irish face of the 21st century is not the Irish face of the 19th, which was not the Irish face of the 9th, which was not the Irish face of the Bronze Age. Each generation adds new layers, new colors, new shapes to the ancient blend. But the distinctive Irish features persist, even in the mixing. The Polish Irish child often has the high cheekbones of the Irish parent. The Nigerian Irish child often carries the pale skin of the Irish grandparent. The Chinese Irish child may have the black hair of both parents, but the green eyes of the Irish ancestor. The Irish face is not disappearing. It is evolving, finding new expressions and new combinations. The face in the crowd is the future of Ireland. It is a face that carries all the layers of history, the hunter-gatherer, the farmer, the steppe migrant, the Viking, the Norman, the planter, along with new layers from across the world. It is a face that is both ancient and modern, both Irish and global, both distinct and universal. Somewhere in the west of Ireland, in a small village where the road ends and the Atlantic begins, there is a face that carries the ancient Irish features with a purity that is rare and precious. It is the face of an old woman, perhaps, or a young man, someone whose ancestry is entirely Irish, whose genes have not been mixed with the wider world, who carries the hunter-gatherer and farmer and steppe DNA in the same proportions as their ancestors 1,000 years ago. This face is not better than the mixed faces of Dublin or the diaspora. It is not more Irish, more authentic, more real, but it is a living connection to the past, a face that could have looked out from a roundhouse 2,000 years ago, that could have illuminated a manuscript in a medieval monastery, that could have stared out from a famine ship at the receding coast of Ireland. The last isolated face is a reminder of what was, of the genetic island that Ireland once was. It is also a reminder of what is being lost, of the ancient features that are being diluted in the global mixing of the 21st century. Whether this loss matters is a question that each person must answer for themselves. Some will see the mixing as a gain, as Ireland becoming part of the wider world, as the Irish face becoming more diverse and more beautiful. Others will mourn the passing of the ancient type, the distinctive features that made the Irish look different from every other European. Both views are valid, both are human, Both reflect the complex emotions that people feel about their identity and their appearance. What will the Irish face look like in 100 years, and 500 years, and 1,000? No one can know for certain, but we can guess. The mixing that began in the late 20th century will continue, accelerated by migration and intermarriage and the global connectedness that makes isolation impossible. The ancient features will persist, carried in the DNA of millions, but they will appear in new combinations, in faces that are neither purely Irish nor purely anything else. The red hair may become rarer, its genetic variants diluted in the larger population, or it may persist, carried by those who value it, who seek Irish partners, who keep the ancient genes alive. The pale skin may become less common as darker skin tones enter the population, or it may persist, selected for by the weak Irish sun that still demands vitamin D synthesis. The distinctive Irish features, the high cheekbones, the long skull, the particular shape of the eyes may fade or may persist, depending on the random chance of genetic inheritance. But whatever the future face looks like, it will carry the history of Ireland in its genes. The hunter-gatherer who walked across the land bridge, the farmer who built Newgrange, the metal worker who wore gold, the monk who copied manuscripts, the warrior who painted himself with woad, the famine emigrant who sailed to America, all of them will be there, in the DNA of every Irish person, whatever their outward appearance. The Irish face is not a static type, but a living history. It is the product of migrations and isolations, of adaptations and accidents, of the Green Island and the wider world. It is different from every other European face because it carries a unique blend of ancient genes, preserved by geography and history, shaped by the weak sun and the misty rain and the Atlantic wind. And that, dear listener, is the real reason the Irish look different. Not because of Spanish sailors or Celtic magic, but because of 12,000 years of history written in bone and blood and DNA, preserved on an island at the western edge of Europe, carried forward into a future that is still being written. And so, dear listener, we leave the story of the Irish face, but not the Irish face itself. It is still there, in the mirror, in the crowd, in the photographs of ancestors, and the faces of children yet unborn. It is a face of mystery and history, of isolation and connection, of the ancient past and the global future. If you have followed this journey through genetics and history, through migrations and isolations, through the science of DNA and the art of the face, then perhaps you have found something more than knowledge. Perhaps you have found a connection to the past, to the land, to the endless story of human movement and adaptation that shaped every face on earth. The Irish face is different, yes, but every face is different. Every face carries a story. Every face is a map of migrations and mixtures that stretch back to the dawn of humanity. The Irish face is special because it has been preserved, isolated, protected from the mixing that transformed other populations. But it is also universal, a reminder that we are all migrants, all mixtures, all carriers of ancient stories written in our genes. Sleep well, dear listener. Let the mists of Ireland wrap around you like a blanket. Let the ancient voices whisper their lullabies. Let the green hills and the rocky coasts and the soft rain sing you to sleep. And when you wake, look in the mirror and see the story written there, the migrations and mixtures that made you who you are. the face that is yours alone, yet connected to every face that has ever been. Good night.